Hey everybody, this is Justin Varnes. You can follow me on Twitter at DownWithIDP. I'm one of the IDP analysts over at fantasypoints.com, and I'm really happy to be a guest here with Josh and the gang over at the IDP show. We're going to talk today about nickel defenders. This is something I've been studying, not just nickel defenders, but really over the past several years. I've been putting a lot of time and effort into trying to figure out where we can find consistency in defensive backfield. I mean, long gone are the days of the traditional box safety and those great cover three schemes where you could just pick one of those quote unquote strong safeties and you'd at least be okay. Defenses are so much more multiple now. It's created a little bit of a mess, but I found a little area we can focus on, and that revolves around these nickel defenders. When we get into nickel and dime packages, how different defenses use players in the slot. Now, there isn't one catch-all. It's this kind of player you're set. However, I have figured out there's a couple little categories, and each of them I've studied their fantasy value and their consistency, and I found a little set of rules we can kind of rely on once we can determine where these players are actually lining up each week. Now, when I first started doing this, I was just kind of taking my own notes, so I used terminology that kind of makes sense, but it also kind of doesn't, because these are real football terms that the defensive coordinators would use, but I don't really use them in the exact same way. So basically, if you start using these terms, like just, if you ever run into like Bill Belichick or something, don't ever ask him about what he thinks about Budda Baker being a nickel safety, because I'm sure he'll probably have his girlfriend karate chop you in the throat for asking such a dumbass question. However, it all makes sense to me in my own stupid brain, so you're stuck now learning this terminology. So we're going to kind of break them down into three categories. The first one, which is the most valuable commodity, I think, when it comes to defensive backs, is what I call a nickel safety. And Budda Baker, as I mentioned, is kind of the prototypical one, at least is how he was used last year. And a nickel safety is essentially somebody who plays what we would call big nickel, which is when a team goes into nickel or possibly dime, they move one of their starting safeties up into that slot position. When you get up in that slot position, you could also get snaps in the box as a linebacker. You could also get snaps off the edge as a defensive lineman in different packages. And that it almost like exponentially increases your value, because if you're playing that close to the line of scrimmage, you're going to pick up more tackles, as we know. You're also going to get it into the backfield more, which means more tackles for loss, more sacks, things like that can really make a difference from week to week. The trick is Budda Baker hasn't always played that role. He played it last year. He has played it in years past. He didn't, however, play it 2 years ago. Every year, these defensive coordinators will move their chess pieces around. So 2 years ago, in 2023, when Budda Baker was playing, he was mostly playing a more traditional role, a traditional safety role. He spent some time in the box and in the slot, but he spent less than half of his snaps in that area in 2023. He averaged about 7.5 tackles a game. Last year, when he averaged closer to, when he was more like 55-60% of the time in that either box or slot or defensive lineman role, his tackles bumped up to about 9.5 per game, and he ended up being one of the most, if not the most, fantasy-friendly DBs for you, depending on your scoring setup, right? So that's when I talk about nickel safeties, it's that sort of position I'm talking about that guys like Budda Baker really have made. Now let's talk about the next category, which are nickel, what I call nickel corners, and that's pretty much a fairly common term for them. These are cornerbacks whose essentially only role is to play the slot when a team moves from base to nickel or dime. So in base, they're not on the field. Now, luckily, because defenses run so many nickel packages, you can still find value here, but it's usually less. That usually has less of the top end of a nickel safety. So we're talking about players like the Bears, Kyler Gordon, or the Bills, Taron Johnson. These are guys who play specifically slot cornerback. They kind of don't do the other roles. And although that's not going to necessarily get you in the top 5 or top 10 most years, sometimes it does, really what it does is it creates a lot of consistency. These nickel corners almost always produce about 5 tackles a game. I mean, it's scary how consistent that is. Kyler Gordon last year, I think, had only one game where he didn't have at least 4 tackles. He was between 4 and 7 tackles for every single game. Never had 11, but also never had 2. And Taron Johnson's another one of those. So that's what I call a nickel corner. And then the third category is what I call an inside-outside corner, or an inside-outside nickel defender. And that's a cornerback who lines up outside in base and then moves inside to the nickel. We've had several examples of that. Keyshawn Nixon was one of them. We've seen a lot of that in Baltimore as well. These are not as fantasy friendly because they spend so much time on the outside as well. And just depending on week to week, how their usage may change, it just really becomes hard to rely on. However, they are typically more reliable than your regular outside corner, for those reasons that if they're hanging around the box, they're likely to be more involved in the tackle game. And then also in CB required leagues, if I'm picking a cornerback, I'm looking for one of those inside-outside corners, if not one of those straight-up nickel corners like a Taron Johnson or Kyler Gordon. So those are kind of the three categories we're talking about. And all three of those categories tend to be more consistent than their safety or corner counterparts that don't spend that much time in the slot in these nickel formations. And the reason that is partly what we've already talked about, but they are usually more involved in the run game. If you're around the box, as we know, your tackle floor raises. You get more opportunities to play the run. There's just a lot more in the short passing game these days, particularly with so many split safety sets. So in general, if you see a guy getting a lot of snaps in the slot, there's a good chance you're going to get a little bit more consistency. Now what I want to do is just kind of try and identify who I think could be some of those players. We're going to talk about a couple that I'm really excited about. One that a situation I'm going to watch very carefully. I invite you to watch that very carefully. And then also to point out a situation, I just want to make sure that everybody's clear on this quote-unquote safety's role on his team. He did it last year. He looks to be doing it again. Let's start with Atlanta. So Atlanta has D. Alford. He's been their slot corner, right? Their nickel corner. He played that role last year. He looks to be playing that this year, which I think is an okay fantasy position, but I'm really actually interested in what's going on with their rookie Xavier Watts. The data I'm compiling here is mainly over the first two preseason games and training camp reports, etc., and then any sort of relevant data that might be sprinkled in from last season that just shows us some sort of trend, right? So far in preseason, D. Alford has played that kind of nickel corner role where he only is playing slot corner. However, Xavier Watts has really, again, it's only two games, but so far he has that nice even spread that we like from Budda Baker of playing a good amount of box snaps, some slot snaps, a little bit in DL, and some free safety slots. If he ends up winning that starting safety job, which I believe he will, I think Watts actually has a really good chance here to see his fantasy value boosted just based on those slot and box snaps that we think are coming his way. The only downside is because they do have Alfred there, we know that he will play a good amount, so it's not going to be where we have Watts exclusively in that nickel role. My favorite target this year for this type of player, this is the type of player that could end up being a top 5 or top 3 safety for us this year, and that's in Las Vegas. I love the way that we're seeing Jeremy Chinn being deployed this year. We knew from his time in Carolina that he's essentially a linebacker playing safety. And when Carolina changed his defensive coordinator and Carolina needed Jeremy Chinn to play more of a split safety role where he had to play deeper, it wasn't the best fit. They ended up letting him go. When Jeremy Chinn last year played in the box, he was incredibly effective. And so far this year in these 2 preseason games, that's what we've seen. We've seen him have that like nickel safety role where he's playing almost exclusive. Matter of fact, every snap he's played this preseason, granted, it's only 2 games, very small sample size. However, every snap he's played so far has been either box, slot, or defensive lineman. And also just a quick shout out to John Macri over there at PFF. I'm drawing a lot of my data from all the stuff he has put together. But he is like exclusively in what should be a very fantasy friendly role. So I'm really liking Jeremy Chinn. Little tiny note to talk about Jamal Adams, who actually looked pretty good playing linebacker. If Jamal Adams is a defensive back in your league, it's worth a very late round flyer to see if he's going to get enough snaps at linebacker. But he actually looked pretty good for being an old man. A situation I'm watching carefully, that's in Green Bay. So Green Bay has a nickel corner in Keyshawn Nixon. Keyshawn also plays outside. He's kind of like he's a little bit hard to pin down because he can be one of those inside corners. but often he plays so much nickel or so much slot. I just kind of think of him as a nickel corner. However, Javon Bullard, their third safety, he played really well in the slot and kind of in the box last year. And from the looks of it, the tea leaves I'm reading, I think we're going to see a lot more 3 safety sets with Xavier McKinney and Evan Williams in Green Bay. And when that happens, it looks to me like it'll be Javon Bullard who will be getting those like fantasy friendly slot box DL snaps, maybe more so than the other two. And also Nixon, because he's a good outside corner, I think we might see Nixon play more outside and Bullard get more snaps in the slot. But we don't really know that yet. That's one just maybe over week 1, week 2, week 3, I'm going to really be zeroed in on. One thing's for sure, we can't necessarily assume that Nixon's going to play a ton in the slot this year. And I think Bullard, because of the presence of Williams and Xavier McKinney, Bullard might be undervalued. He's somebody I would take a late round flyer on in case he ends up kind of in that position. We saw how 3 safeties can really, all 3 of them, be fantasy friendly. We've seen it in multiple setups. Maybe the Minnesota Vikings is the best example of that over the last couple of years with their rotation with Josh Metellus, Cam Bynum, and of course Harrison Smith. All 3 were fantasy relevant. We might see that again in Green Bay. However, actually, my money is on Bullard over the other 2 based on just what we've seen in terms of his preseason snaps. Finally, I want to mention a player who I think is being overdrafted. He is technically listed as a safety, but Jalen Pitre last year excelled in the slot, and it does look like Houston is going to keep him in the slot this year, which sounds great, except he's really not playing any other safety positions. He didn't really last year, and so far through preseason, we haven't really seen him play that much either. He actually looks straight up like a nickel corner to me. And remember, nickel corners are like 5 tackles a game kind of guy, and that's basically what we got out of Jalen Pitre last year. I think we're going to have another season of him being a 4 to 6 tackle guy, which is great unless you're drafting him thinking he's a starting safety and hoping for more like 6 to 8 tackles a game. Just be cautious. I think Jalen Pitre is essentially what I would call my nickel corner. We know that's consistent, but he's not going to be that kind of Buda Baker level. Okay, enough rambling about that. I'm going to talk to Josh and the gang about popping on throughout the season, maybe adding some more reports once we get some real data. I cannot stand having to watch preseason football because they throw a bunch of stuff out there, and then as soon as the season starts, you might as well just flush it all down the toilet. It took me a lot of combing to just find even these players with enough consistency to rely on. Once we get some actual football under our belts, I'll check back in and see if we can't uncover some other fantasy gold for you guys. All right. Again, my name is Justin Varnes. You can follow me on Twitter at DownWithIDP. Big shout out to everybody at the IDP show for having me on as a guest. We'll see you on the next one.